Hello, and thank you for joining me. Coming up on the show, lots of news and safety tips today, including a federal court makes a ruling that's making both helicopter and crop duster pilots unhappy. Another single-engine jet is taking to the skies, but it's not the Cirrus Vision jet. A popular helicopter is going back into production, and the company is testing unmanned operations. And the FAA has just changed the way you need to fly one popular maneuver to pass the private and commercial check rides. And one of the most famous board games you've certainly heard of will soon be available with an aviation version. Plus, what you should know about Tissa traffic systems, how they work, and which aircraft they don't display. And finally, a listener responds to my AOPA magazine column about unstable approaches and describes what he saw while sitting next to three different pilots flying into the same challenging airport. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to share my over 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot, author, and flight instructor, and bring you news and safety tips to help you fly safely. And before we get started, I wanted to let you know I have just posted a listener survey. I would love to get your feedback. It's only episode 12. It's very early in the life of the show. You've given me a lot of great positive feedback, but I'm sure there are things that I can do to improve. So please go out and take the survey. Give me some feedback on the different segments of this podcast, what you like, what you'd like to hear more of, what you'd like to hear less of, and I'll do my best to try and improve the show. Please go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey, SURVEY. And if you're using the Apple Podcast app on an iPhone or iPad, you can just touch the cover artwork at the top of the display, and you'll find a link to the survey. I'll plan to keep the survey open for the entire month of June, and then I'll let you know the results early in July. Thanks so much for helping me out. And stand by, because the news starts now. From AvWeb, budget details released by the White House show an apparent commitment by the administration to privatize the air traffic control system, according to NBAA. Quote, "The president's budget takes the public's elected representatives out of the equation and leaves it to a private board to ensure the public's interest is being well served," said NBA President Ed Bolin in a news release. "We are troubled and concerned by this proposal and will review it closely as the legislative process moves forward." NATA also expressed concern about the proposal, which it says reduces FAA funding by almost $300 million below current levels for the fiscal year beginning October 1, and assumes the creation of a separate air traffic control corporation beginning in FY 2021. Quote, "We cannot make the justification for ATC privatization a self-fulfilling prophecy by making cuts to important programs that need immediate funding," said NATA President Martin Hiller. The proposed FAA budget would reduce spending on the modernization of our air traffic control system and continue what has been a 6-year downward spiral in airport funding, said Hiller. The documents released by the president on Tuesday provide greater detail to the preliminary budget plans the White House released on March 16th. They outline the administration's blueprint for federal spending in the coming fiscal year, according to NBAA. The White House and the big airlines have promoted the notion of privatizing ATC. Quote, "Within this budget, the president has made clear his administration's plan to pursue a concept that has raised a host of concerns, not just among aviation stakeholders, but also among congressional lawmakers from both political parties, mayors from across the country, organizations from the political left and right, consumer groups, and a majority of Americans," Bolin said. As the debate continues in Congress over FAA reauthorization and modernization of the nation's aviation system, we will work with Congress to promote forward-thinking initiatives that preserve America's aviation leadership position and ensure the ATC system continues to serve all Americans in the decades to come. Well, clearly privatization is continuing to heat up. I think we're going to hear a lot more about this prior to the FAA's reauthorization bill, which will be due in September. From AOPA, pilots are flocking to Basic Med because it's less burdensome and allows them to work with their personal physician who knows them best, said AOPA President Mark Baker. It's easier, cheaper, and safer, which is why we are seeing this positive reaction. Reactions to Basic Med have been overwhelmingly positive. One pilot from Tyler, Texas, had given up on the often frustrating special issuance process and found Basic Med easier to navigate, which allowed him to get back to enjoying his passion for aviation. Another AOPA member of almost 30 years was recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and shared his excitement for how Basic Med has lifted a burden off my shoulders. He no longer feels the stress of jumping through the hoops to get all of the documentation every year or feel rushed to get the required paperwork completed properly and on time. He is thrilled that he can now get cleared by his family doctor, who is familiar with his medical history. And just as an aside, I was talking with one of the front desk people at the flying club where I teach. She mentioned that there have been a number of people in the last few weeks who have come by and re-signed up to fly. Many of them had dropped out of flying knowing that Basic Med was coming, and now that it's here, they're getting back into the skies. From Forbes magazine, drone pilots are buzzing with excitement over a court ruling Friday striking down a 2015 FAA rule that required them to register with the government. The U.S. Court of Appeals didn't mince words in finding the FAA had overstepped its authority. Quote, statutory interpretation does not get much simpler, the court said. 2 years ago, the FAA ordered all drone pilots, professionals, and hobbyists to register, pay a fee, and put an ID number on their aircraft. John Taylor, a recreational drone pilot who lives in Washington, D.C., balked. In its summary, the court wrote that Taylor, a recreational pilot, did not think the FAA could order him to register, and the court concluded Taylor is right. But while drone pilots are happy, others are not. From AvWeb, a recent federal court decision that the FAA has no authority to require drone operators to register is not sitting well with many aviators. Helicopter Association International issued a statement this week saying it strongly disagrees with the ruling, adding that helicopter pilots are deeply concerned about our ability to fly safely in airspace where pilots could encounter any unmanned aircraft, be it commercial or otherwise. The FAA registration program provides a means to educate the public about the hazards of careless drone operation, HAI said. The group asked Congress to return authority over drone operations to the FAA to ensure the safety of the national airspace system. The National Agricultural Aviation Association also issued a statement this week asking Congress to reverse the change. From General Aviation News, new and revised airman certification standards have been published. Revisions to the year-old ACS and the new ACS for the Commercial Pilot Certificate were posted to the FAA's Airman Testing website on May 18th. FAA introduced the first two ACS volumes in June 2016 to replace the Practical Test Standards, or PTS, following a multi-year industry-driven effort to make test standards more meaningful and relevant to the way pilots fly today. Applicants and flight instructors should note, for example, that in the revised private pilot ACS and the new commercial pilot ACS, the area of operation on slow flight and stalls calls for an applicant to establish and maintain an airspeed at which any further increase in angle of attack, increase in load factor, or reduction in power would result in a stall warning. Example, aircraft buffet, stall horn, etc. As of June 12th, that standard will replace the current ACS slow flight demonstration, consisting of establishing an airspeed approximately 5 to 10 knots above the 1G stall speed, at which the airplane is capable of maintaining controlled flight without activating a stall warning. So if you're going to be doing slow flight, it looks like you're going to be doing it just a little bit slower than you were based on the ACS published last year. From the Washington Post, authorities say at least a dozen small planes have been severely damaged when winds of nearly 50 miles an hour struck a North Texas municipal airport and flipped some aircraft. Denton police say some airplanes were found piled on top of each other as officials surveyed Tuesday's storm damage at Denton Enterprise Airport. Nobody was hurt. Airport spokeswoman Lindsay Baker said 12 to 15 planes were damaged, along with about a dozen hangars and other structures at the city-owned aviation complex. Baker had no immediate damage estimate. The National Weather Service says the storm struck Denton around 1 a.m. on Tuesday. Forecaster Patricia Sanchez says an initial review confirmed peak winds of 48 miles an hour, but she expects the official number to be higher. Denton is 30 miles northwest of Texas, and it's where I took a DA-42 all of 2 or 3 weeks ago. From General Aviation News, Stratus Aircraft has completed the first flight test phase of its Stratus 714 single-engine personal jet. In logging 52 hours over 33 flights, the Stratus 714 was flown at weights up to 8,300 pounds over a range of center of gravity positions. During the initial flight program, the aircraft was flown to 320 knots and up to an altitude of 17,000 feet, with only minor modifications, according to company officials, who note the aircraft performed as expected. The Stratus 714 is a personal jet with a cruise speed of 400 knots and a range of 1,500 miles. With that performance, the aircraft could fly from Seattle to Miami in 7 hours with just one stop, company officials claim. The company is not taking deposits until the aircraft is closer to certification. However, it is recording expressions of interest, according to company officials. In international news, from digitaltrends.com, a reassuring sight for many plane passengers is that of the air traffic control tower, its highly trained occupants casting a watchful eye over the airport from on high, ensuring the security of the runways while organizing the movement of aircraft on the tarmac and in the immediate airspace. So, how do you like the idea of a control tower with no one in it? And we talked about one of these last week in Virginia. And this week we're talking about the London City Airport, whose controllers will soon be sitting in a building in a small English village 70 miles away, conducting their work via live stream video. London City Airport will be the first in the United Kingdom to use the high-tech system when it begins trials in 2018. The setup, developed by Saab Digital Air Traffic Solutions, has already been tested in a number of countries, including Australia and Sweden. The technology uses 14 high-definition cameras to build a 360-degree view of the airport. From Switzerland, EBACE, the European Business Aviation Convention and Exhibition, has just wrapped up their annual 3-day show. The exhibition brings together business leaders, government officials, and others involved in every aspect of business aviation. The impressive exhibition takes place over 3 days at the magnificent PAL Expo, which is located next to the Geneva airport. According to AvWeb, several U.S. manufacturers announced models that are now certified for sales in Europe at the convention. Piper said it has been awarded approval for the top-of-the-line single-engine turboprop, the M600, which was first FAA certified in June of last year. Cirrus said it has received EASA certification for its $2 million Vision Jet and has made its first delivery in Europe. Sales of both aircraft are expected to benefit from a recent rule change in Europe that allows single-engine turbine aircraft to be used for commercial operations in IFR conditions. Also at the show, Cessna said its new super mid-size Citation Longitude jet was debuted at EBACE for the first time, and that they've had their first sale in Europe, with a copy going to Travel Service, which is located in the Czech Republic. The jet is still in development, though they have 4 aircraft which are in the flight test fleet. By the way, that Cirrus Vision Jet mentioned in the story was flown to Europe by my friend Luke Lyson, and if you want to see some of his photos and videos, go to Facebook and search for The Flight Academy. And coming back to the U.S. from AvWeb, the newly in-production K-MAX helicopter, built by Cayman Aerosystems of Connecticut, flew for the first time on May 12th, the company announced last week. The single-seat K-MAX features a counter-rotating rotor system and is designed to be rugged and low maintenance. It's optimized for external load operations and vertical reference flight. The aircraft can lift up to 6,000 pounds. The first 2 production aircraft are being built on a newly reopened commercial production line in Bloomfield, Connecticut. The aircraft was first certified by the FAA in 1994, and it was in production through 2003. The aircraft is currently in use worldwide for firefighting, logging, and other missions requiring repetitive aerial lift capabilities, the company said. And this may be the most interesting part of the story. The company said that they are testing additional unmanned firefighting and humanitarian missions for the K-MAX, so they may be looking to turn this into a really large drone. And finally, if you like board games, well, you've certainly heard of Monopoly, but have you heard of Aviation Monopoly? I found this post on Facebook earlier in the week. There's a company which is looking to put out the Aviation Collector's Edition board game of the famous Monopoly game. Best of all, if you're an aviation business, you can buy places on the board. Instead of Boardwalk or Park Place, it could be your business name for as little as $4,800. The game is available for early purchase for $29.95. That's the pre-production special. After June 2nd, they say the game goes up to $49.95. You can find all the details at aviationmonopoly.com. And I sure hope that they end up with a aviationnewstalk.com podcast square on the Monopoly board. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, we talk about Tissa, the traffic information system, the low-cost traffic system you can install in the cockpit, how those systems work and when they won't work. Plus, a listener letter talking about unstable approaches he's seen flown into a challenging airport. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Before I get to the Tissa traffic, I've got just a slew of announcements here, so let me go ahead and run through them. First, I wanted to share with you that we had a really great interview on this week's episode of Airplane Geeks with the Zunum Aero founder, Matt Knapp. Well, I had not heard of Zunum Aero before the interview, but essentially they've been a startup company for 4 years. They are working on developing hybrid electric power for an aircraft they're developing that's about the size of a Pilatus PC-12. So figure, single engine, 10, 12 passenger type aircraft. And what's exciting about it is for shorter trips, they're planning to use just electricity. So for trips out, 30 to 50 miles, only electricity. And the reason they're doing that is electricity is a lot less expensive than fuel. So they're looking to be able to develop aircraft that can fly from a lot of cities that don't have service today with costs that are competitive with driving. I know, sounds pretty phenomenal. And I think they're looking to have these deployed by about 2022. So go on out to airplanegeeks.com/453, which is the episode number. You can hear about Zunum Aero, or go to Zunum, ZUNUM.aero to read about them. Also, I had an email from Lightspeed, and I've been a big fan of Lightspeed for years. I've had headsets for probably at least 15 years. And they announced that they are doing an upgrade from the Zulu 2, which I own, to the Zulu 3, which I tried out about 2 weeks ago. And for $200, you can go ahead and upgrade everything. And no, they're not paying me to say this. They don't even know I'm telling you this. So just to let you know. So the nice thing I liked about the Zulu 3 when I tried it was the ear cups are larger. There's more room inside for your ear, which is great. And the email said they'll add the new Kevlar reinforced cable. They'll add 2 years to your existing warranty. And there's a new control box, all for $200. So anyway, if that's of interest to you, contact Lightspeed. Also, I expect we'll have a Newsmakers episode coming up sometime in the next month talking about Basic Med, and I'd like to get all of your inputs ahead of time. So if you will send me your experiences, your concerns, your issues, what's been working, what hasn't been working, we'll be able to talk about it on the show with someone who can address those things. So go out to aviationnewstalk.com/contact and send me an email and let me know about your Basic Med experiences. I've got a couple of trips coming up. Looks like I'm headed out on June the 7th for Denver, flying a Cirrus SR-22 up to Salt Lake City, and then be spending a day up in Salt Lake City doing some training with the owner on that. And then Friday, the 9th of June, would find me in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is not terribly far from where I grew up, spending a weekend there for a Cirrus CPPP, teaching in the weekend long pilot proficiency program. And also, I just a couple of days ago wrote a nomination for a friend of mine who is applying for the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award. If you're not familiar with this, this is a program that the FAA has had for a long time, which is used to recognize pilots who have been flying for at least 50 years and have exhibited professionalism, skill, and aviation expertise throughout that time. So the rules for the program are you have to have at least 50 or more years of civil and military flying experience. Up to 20 of those years can be in the U.S. military, and the effective date for the 50 years is the date of the nominee's first solo flight. And the 50 years can be computed consecutively or non-consecutively, and you have to be a U.S. citizen. So if you have a friend that you think qualifies, go out and just Google Master Pilot Award, and you'll find all the information about how to apply for the FAA's Wright Brothers Award. So I was happy to write this recommendation for a friend of mine and look forward to seeing him accept that award sometime in the future. And in a moment, I'm going to be talking about the Traffic Information Service, which is the way some aircraft get traffic displayed in the cockpit. And I'll be reading from my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook. This has been around for almost 10 years, and we're now in the 5th edition. If you would like to get a copy, not only will you learn about G1000, but there's a chapter that talks in detail about all the XM weather services. So if you want to know why you're seeing some things on Sirius XM radar and not seeing other things, this will tell you all the details. Also tells you, for example, why you're not going to see all the lightning with the lightning service. So just go ahead and call 800-247-6553, $34.95 plus shipping. You'll get everything you need to know about glass cockpit aircraft, and you'll also learn a lot more about XM weather as well as about traffic services. So in a moment, we'll be back talking about TIS. Hey, let's talk traffic. Last week I talked about the limitations of portable ADS-B receivers, and if you have one of those and you didn't hear that show, go back and take a listen to it. We're not going to be talking about ADS-B in this show, but it's obviously becoming a more important solution for traffic as more aircraft are being equipped with ADS-B out. But let's talk about some of the other systems. Just to give a brief overview, the most expensive system is TCAS. We hear about that all the time in the news. Those solutions are $30,000 and up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're found mostly in the airlines. It would be really rare to find one of those in a single-engine piston aircraft. Those systems work off of transponders, and they are special in that they can tell airliners whether to climb or descend to avoid traffic. In fact, pilots in TCAS-equipped aircraft are now required to follow those resolution advisories. So if that system tells them to climb, they are required to climb despite what the controller may have told them. Now, you will find some similar lower-cost systems in GA aircraft known as TAS, TAS, Traffic Advisory Systems. So these are similar in the sense that they are actively interrogating the transponders of other nearby aircraft. But what they're doing is they're estimating the distance and the direction to that traffic just by the signal strength and the direction from which the signal is coming in. And so they give a slightly inaccurate position of the aircraft, but they're not bad. What they don't do is they don't tell you whether to climb or whether to descend as the TCAS systems do. But they're very popular, and you could expect probably to pay about $10,000 or more for most of these systems. So they're not cheap, but they're really awesome systems, particularly because they work anywhere. I mean, you could be in Baja, Mexico, and as long as other aircraft have transponders that are turned on, you're going to see them on your TAS system. Now, there was a cheaper alternative that never really took off. Back 10 more years ago, you may remember the Ryan TCAD, TCAD. So these are passive devices that, instead of actively interrogating other transponders like the TAS system, they just sit back and they basically try to listen for transponders that are being interrogated by either radar or other TAS and other systems that will cause the transponders to light up on nearby aircraft. So the portable Zion system was a form of that as well, too. Again, these systems, there are just not very many of them around anymore. And the TCAD stood for Traffic Collision Avoidance Devices. Now, a very popular system that you see in a lot of modern aircraft these days is TIS. TIS is Traffic Information Service, and the FAA essentially broadcasts TIS traffic through a Mode S transponder. And these are available in just about all of the G1000 equipped aircraft you're going to find, as well as some of the Cirrus Perspective. Most of the, by the time you get up to kind of the Cessna 182 and the Cirrus level, most of those airplanes have TIS, but they've upgraded to TAS, and the TIS isn't being used. But if you're in your basic 172, the lower cost system is TIS. It's probably about $5,000 for that Mode S transponder, so it's one of the less expensive ways to get traffic into the aircraft. Now, unfortunately, the FAA announced back in 2005 that the safety benefits of TIS did not warrant the cost of continuing to upgrade the radar systems that provide that information. So, unfortunately, TIS is eventually going to be gone, but in the meantime, it's still a pretty useful service, especially around metropolitan areas. Okay, now going to my G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook. Traffic Information Service. TIS transmits data on up to 8 aircraft within 7 nautical miles horizontally, 3,500 feet above and 3,000 feet below your current position. It sends data on these intruder aircraft's position, altitude, altitude trend, and ground track. To be visible, however, these intruder aircraft must have an operating transponder and be within radar range. That is to say that they have to have line of sight between themselves and the radar, just as you have to have line of sight between yourself and the radar. Unlike the TCAS systems used by the airlines, TIS only provides alerts. It does not recommend maneuvers for avoiding intruder aircraft. An alert is generated anytime an aircraft is within 1/2 mile horizontally or within 500 feet vertically. Alerts are also generated anytime an aircraft is projected to enter this area within the next 34 seconds. And that's, by the way, to help detect fast-moving aircraft that might be getting close to you very rapidly. These alerts, called traffic advisories or TAs, are displayed on the traffic map page with a solid yellow circle. A half yellow circle on the outer range ring is used if the TA aircraft is beyond the current map range. Whenever a TA is generated, an audio traffic alert is heard through the audio panel. Boy, and if you ever heard that, that thing is loud. It just kind of goes, traffic, traffic. Also, there's going to be an annunciator that appears on the PFD if you're in the G1000. Other traffic which doesn't meet the criteria for a TA is displayed as an open white diamond with a trend vector showing the aircraft's direction of travel. The intruder's altitude deviation from your altitude is displayed in hundreds of feet. Also, an altitude trend arrow is displayed if the aircraft is climbing or descending at greater than 500 feet per minute. Now, there are a number of limitations to TIS. Let's talk about those. TIS is only available within about 55 nautical miles of certain FAA radar approach systems. There are about 100 of these in the U.S., and they're mostly around Class B and Class C airports. Depending upon your altitude and obstructions between your aircraft and the radar site, the actual distance at which you receive service may be less. Aircraft below you that are below the radar floor in your area will not show up. Also, if you fly directly over top the radar site, you may lose TIS service since the maximum elevation of the radar is 34 degrees and there is a cone of silence, they actually use that term, directly above the radar site. Finally, the altitude encoder in your aircraft must be working so that altitude deviations between you and other aircraft can be calculated. If your altitude encoder is not working, TIS data will be suppressed and no traffic is displayed. Now, the approach radar sweeps every 5 seconds and then it transmits the TIS data on the next sweep. Thus, the data you receive in the cockpit is a minimum of 5 seconds old. In order to present traffic in a real-time position, the TIS ground stations use an algorithm to predict intruder traffic positions at the time you will receive the data to compensate for this delay. However, if the intruder aircraft is maneuvering, their bearing information, indicated by a white line showing their direction of travel, may be inaccurate, though the position and altitude information are generally still accurate. If you make a steep turn, TIS may generate a false target at your location and altitude. Seeing a TIS target materialize right next to you can certainly scare you, but the false target will usually disappear within 1 or 2 radar sweeps. Other errors can occur when a converging aircraft is on a course that crosses your course at a shallow angle. If either you or the intruder suddenly change course when you're within about 1/4 of a nautical mile of each other, TIS will display the intruder on the opposite side of where it actually is. So sometimes you have to look just a little bit to the left or right from where the position is actually shown on the screen. Now, as your distance from the radar site increases, the accuracy of the system also decreases. At these longer distances, TIS cannot accurately determine bearing and distance information for intruder aircraft that are close to you. Therefore, whenever you're more than 30 nautical miles away from the radar site, TIS will display an intruder aircraft within 3/8 of a nautical mile of your location, either directly in front of you or behind you. That's to avoid the confusion that would arise if, for example, an intruder to your right were presented to your left on the display. Thus, at longer distances from the radar site, you should assume that any aircraft displayed next to your position could be up to 3/8 of a mile away in any direction. Now, here's another problem, which I didn't write about in the book. Imagine that your transponder is off by 200 feet, and you probably would never know it. I think you probably know that if your transponder is 300 feet or more off from the correct altitude, Air traffic control will tell you to stop squawking altitude. But if the air is less than 300 feet, they'll never tell you about it. So imagine that your aircraft is showing 200 feet high and another aircraft is actually registering 200 feet low. That can give you a combined error of up to 400 feet from the altitude that's displayed in the cockpit. So frankly, anytime I see an aircraft that's displayed as being within 500 feet of my altitude, I consider that an emergency to spot that aircraft. And if I can't, I want to increase the altitude difference between me by either climbing or descending. So don't get complacent when you see an aircraft that says that it's 400 or 500 feet above you. It could be almost exactly at your altitude if by bad luck that both of your transponders are in error by a couple hundred feet in opposite directions. So if you were to compare TISS with TAS, which we talked about briefly earlier, TISS is probably going to give you a slightly more accurate location for the intruder aircraft, and it's going to have little vectors attached to those symbols so you can tell what direction those aircraft are moving in. Unfortunately, it's only going to work when you're within 55 miles of certain radar sites here in the U.S. By contrast, TAS is going to work everywhere. However, there are no vectors on the symbols for intruder aircraft, so to determine what direction they're moving, you have to stare at those aircraft for quite a while to see where they're moving relative to your position on the radar scope. But of course, the huge advantage is that TAS works everywhere. You don't have to be close to a radar site. Well, that wraps it up on TISS. Hopefully you found something new that you didn't know about the Traffic Information System. And if you'd like me to read other things from my various books, let me know. I try to make it conversational so it didn't sound too much like I was reading from the book, but that's where a lot of the material came from. In a moment, we'll be back with an email from a listener who responded talking about unstabilized approaches he had seen flying into a challenging airport in Northern California. Be back in a moment. Hey, welcome back. Usually I read a listener question, but nobody sent me one this week. So if you want to send a question for next week, just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on listener questions, and you can record a question, or you can click on contact and send me an email. So without a listener question, I thought I would go to an email I received recently from a gentleman who had read my article in AOPA Pilot Magazine back in the April issue. Page 20, was about the economics of unstable approaches. And I gave 3 examples of pilots who ended up either paying a lot of money or who died as a result of unstable approaches. And this gentleman, whose name is Charlie, thought that I might want to look at a follow-up article because he felt that after witnessing 3 unstable approaches to this one airport in California, that the ultimate cause was not the unstable approach at the very end, but if you look back a couple of steps, the lack of planning to make a proper approach to the airport. And I agree with this point. If you don't plan properly and you end up high and fast, well, you're going to have an unstable approach and you should go around. So Charlie writes, my thinking on this came to me after my trip to Lamson Field, which is 1 Oscar 2. He said this was my 3rd trip in 2 months, each one with a different pilot. Coming up from the Bay Area, Lamson Field has some interesting geographic environmental challenges that make it very easy to get into an unstabilized approach. There is a range of mountains to the southeast with a 4,800-foot peak 12 miles from the airport and a 3,500-foot peak 9 miles from the airport. Coming from the Bay Area, you have to go over these mountains, and therefore the lowest reasonable cruise altitude is 6,500 feet. Most people tend to wait until they've passed the 4,800-foot peak before they start their descent to the 1,380-foot elevation airport. The bottom line is to get to pattern altitude, you have a lot of descending to do in a very short distance, which can very easily put you in the pattern too high and too fast, the classic definition of an unstabilized approach. And before I continue reading, I went to the map and I did some measurements, and I measured about 13 miles from the mountain, and I calculated that if you passed over the top of it at 6,500 feet, and then we're going to descend down to 1,400 feet, which is the field elevation, you'd have to drop 5,100 feet over those 13 miles. and that would be a rate of 392 feet per nautical mile. Now, if you were to be flying along at 120 knots, you'd have to double that. That means from the moment you cross the top of the mountain, you'd have to descend at 785 feet per minute. Now, if you were in a 182 in a descent, you might be doing 150 knots, in which case you need to descend the entire time at 980 feet per minute. And you might think, oh, sure, I can do that. But consider this. When you arrive at the threshold of the airport, you're doing 150 knots. You don't have the flaps out. So you're actually going to have to descend much faster than that in order to ultimately get slowed up and get the flaps deployed. So that's the situation facing pilots coming from the southeast into this airport. So he said, let me describe the 3 trips I took. The first was with a Bonanza pilot who had over 3,000 hours, most of them in his Bonanza. He is one of these pilots who straps on the plane and flies it like it's an extension of himself. He crossed the mountain at 6,500 feet and started his descent. We finally ended up on a 1.5 mile final where he was fast and about 1,000 feet higher than he should have been. My friend looked at me and said, "No problem, I can make this." And I wisely turned to him and said, "I'm sure you can, but do you really want to scare me? There's no one else in the pattern. Why don't you do a 360 and make this an easy landing?" Wisely, my friend took my advice, made the 360, slowed the plane down, got it to the right altitude, and the rest was a textbook approach and a beautiful landing. My second experience was 2 weeks ago with a CFI, the flying club, who owns a Turbo Baron. He too crossed those mountains at 6,500 feet, started a 500 foot per minute descent, went over the airport, then further northwest over the lake where he continued his descent, and he slowed the aircraft down to approach speed. He then very gently made a 45 right downwind entry, flew a beautiful square pattern, made a very gentle landing right on the numbers, and without stepping on the brakes, we got off at midfield. No drama. My third experience today was with my airplane partner and his instructor. Again, we flew over the mountains at 6,500 feet and started a descent. Looking at the pilot, I could see he was tense and nervous as he was trying to force the plane down and slow it up. We were still 2,000 feet high when we flew over the airport, and despite all of his efforts, we were still 1,000 feet high when he entered a very non-rectangular base leg. It was at that point where he looked out the window, saw the approach was all screwed up, wisely departed the pattern again, going toward the lake, got to the right altitude and speed, then re-entered the pattern and made a very good approach and landing. 3 experiences, 3 safe stabilized landings, but 2 of them required a go-around. And he says, I count the 360 as a go-around. So what did I learn? That if you have a stabilized approach, you've got to fly a stabilized pattern. And if you want to fly a stabilized pattern, then you have to fly a stabilized pattern entry. That's a lot of stabilizers. When I think back, the big difference with the no-drama CFI was that he had the big picture in mind long before he started his descent over the mountains. He knew how high he was, he knew how far the airport was, he knew pattern altitude, and he realized that the simplest solution was to overfly the airport and continue out of the pattern until he got the plane to pattern altitude and pattern speed. The 2 words that come to mind for him are situational awareness. He had great situational awareness, therefore there was no surprises, and he was also very relaxed. The other 2 pilots clearly were not that relaxed and were clearly surprised when they got into the pattern. Max, there's probably a lot more that we can say about situational awareness, but I would argue that those 3 incidents you reported on, that would be in my article, had the pilots had better situational awareness, they might not have entered those unstabilized approaches, and we wouldn't be talking about them or mourning the loss of life. So, yep, totally agree. I have flown in this airport a number of times, and I do something slightly different. Rather than overfly the airport, I just overfly the entire length of the lake, which is gorgeous. Why not descend over a beautiful lake? Then at the north end of the lake, I make a left turn, which sets me up perfectly for a 45-degree entry to the airport. So I agree with you, Charlie. If you have the big picture in mind, plan ahead. You don't have to end up high and fast and be surprised that you need to go around. And that wraps it up for this show. Please take a moment to give me feedback through the listener survey. You can find it at aviationnewstalk.com/survey, or if you're using an iPhone or iPad, just click on the logo for this show at the top of your screen, and you'll find a link to the survey. You'll also find links there where you can record a listener question or send me an email. And if you're out there and you're thinking about buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, give me a call early in the process so I can help you with that evaluation. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. If you've enjoyed this show, please tell your friends. And if you really like it, go ahead and leave a review in the Apple Podcast app or sign up for one of my courses at pilotlearning.com. In the meantime, fly safely and keep the blue side up.